Welcome to the Truth Wins podcast. This is episode, what we're calling 64 and a half, because we're going to be talking about Russia-Ukraine crisis, and we want to wedge that in so it gets up as soon as we can upload it. So we're going to wedge it between 64 and 65. So episode 64 and a half, what's really behind the Russian-Ukraine crisis. My name is Todd. As always, my good friend Stu is with us. Say hey, Stu.
Hey, Stu.
And we are doing a hot topic today because of the madness going on over Russia-Ukraine. And not that you and I are, foreign experts to know exactly what's going on, but doing some study, just even some preliminary studies, and knowing the history of that region will help us have a little better view of what maybe the true story is. Would you agree?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. But before we do that, we're going to start a new segment on our podcast, and we're going to call it Time to Stump Stu.
Oh, no.
Yes, this will be a fun part. So we're getting a lot of interaction on social media, on our Facebook page and whatever else. And so our team has sent to me several questions or comments. So I thought it'd be fun for each episode to do one or two of those and just get a quick reply. Not that we need to get defensive, because sometimes, that online courage is quite strong for a lot of people, right. The cyber courage. But overall, there's some legitimate feedback, questions, comments. So I think it'd be good for us just to interact with some folks that take the time to listen to our podcast, and we thank you for that. But we want to kind of wrestle a little bit with some of the things you have. So I'm throwing these at Stu. He hasn't had time to look at them and really articulate an answer. So that's why we call it Time to Stump Stu.
Just ask any question about technology or music.
Okay. So yes, if you really want to stump them, give a nice tech question. But these aren't, thankfully, we're not starting with tech questions. First one, though, is from our podcast on aliens and ghosts and do they exist. Richard said, aliens, yes. Meaning, yes, he believes they exist because the pyramids are proof of it. A bunch of camel jockeys didn't quarry 60-ton blocks of stone that were perfectly cut and stack it 300 feet high. We can't do it today with hydraulics and helicopters. What do you say to Richard about that?
Richard's got a few things he's got to clean up a little there. It's 450 feet high. It's not 300 feet high. They weren't camel jockeys. The ancient Egyptians were actually different than the people who live in Egypt now, who are Arab peoples.
When did that switch? It was a long...
Yeah. Do you remember we haven't talked about too much yet in terms of ancient Egypt and the Israelites stay there when they were in slavery. But almost every country that seems to attack Israel or do bad things to Israel seems to not be around for long or come out as something else. There aren't too many Amalekites left, which is why I said if we ever started a private school, we should have called them the Fighting Amalekites. I thought that was just a cute name.
You'd lose every game, though, huh?
But yeah, the ancient Egyptians were actually probably a lot smarter than we think. And I used to try to get all the students in my class to realize that people in the ancient times were not dumb. They just didn't have all the cool tech toys we have to keep information at hand.
Now, you were over in Egypt for how long?
2 months on a Fulbright thing. And before I went, I used to teach ancient Egyptian mythology and history, and we talked about some of the technological advances they came up with. And one of the things that, we talk about is in a triangle, the opposite side of a right triangle of the right angle is called the hypotenuse. And that actually comes from a term that means rope stretcher, because the ancient Egyptians did not have levels like we do with little bubbles in the water and everything. They had to figure out these things using what they had at hand. So they figured out to dig channels and stretch ropes. And they actually aligned the corners of the pyramids with north, south, east, and west. I mean, it's a pretty amazing technological feat considering what they were working with.
Yeah. And it's understandable that people say, well, it had to be aliens because we're not smart enough to do it now with the technology and the tools that we have. How could, again, it's with that worldview that everybody, in ancient history were a bunch of country
Dummies.
bumpkins,
Yeah.
and they couldn't even spell,
isn't
let alone
true.
it was far from the truth. In fact, you run into that same situation over in Israel and Jerusalem when you look at the Temple Mount. They have stones that are the size of a bus and weigh however many tons, and they have no idea how the stones got there because there's not like a quarry just 100 yards away. So they had to be shipped in and brought inland all the way to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So how did Herod the Great, how did he get this going? And they don't know, and they have like computer animated, maybe it was oxen and pulley system that they were able to get it there. But again, we're just scratching our head. So that's recent history. Was that aliens? Because if you want to go with that answer to aliens, then you've got a lot of stuff that's been built throughout human history, which is a marvel, a wonder of the world.
Right.
And it's either they were smarter back then and able to do more without the trucks and the stuff we have today, or, again, maybe aliens.
Yeah, there's one particular stone underneath there that's like 45 feet long, 14 feet high, and about 11 feet wide. And you couldn't move it unless you had a special crane today. And we don't know how they did it, but they did it.
Okay.
And it's not at the bottom.
Good. Well, that's a good question. Again, those are tough things you scratch your head on, like how could they make that back then? But I think it does come down to worldview. Were they pretty brilliant people? And we've talked several times how you make a copy of a copy of a copy. It's that second law of thermodynamics, that we're getting dumber, not smarter, that we're on the shoulders of giants, and we have the technology and the math and all those things that all these people have done forever. All right, let's jump into another one. We'll just do two on this one. Raymond says, so we wouldn't do, this is on our episode on Not Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So we wouldn't do good things without God making us do them. Most of all the evil things that are done in this world are done in the name of God or Allah or some other man-made deity.
Yeah. So how do we even know what good is? That's the problem. Without God, there is no good. It's just a matter of personal taste. It's like that quote that we used from the Jeane Kirkpatrick, that was the UN representative, who said, so those of you who are cultural relativists assume that, slavery is just another way to get a society's work done. Cannibalism is just a matter of taste, all those kind of things. There have to be set ways to differentiate good from bad, right from wrong. And if you start making it a human thing, then it becomes a matter of just personal taste and going through the cafeteria line and picking out what I like.
Yeah. It's all subjective, relative.
Yeah.
There's no way to know good from evil. Okay. Well, that's our first of what I think we're going to do every episode now, called Time to Stump Stu. So you did well. But we'll just keep throwing some curveballs at you in upcoming episodes. Well, today we want to talk about Russia, though, and Ukraine. Just recently, in the last few weeks, Russia has invaded. Of course, as the media paints it, Putin, big bad guy, coming into Ukraine. Zelensky is the man who's fighting on the front lines with his people, trying to save his country. What I've learned, especially in the last few years, is if any time the media zigs, I'm probably going to zag, because there's more than meets the eye, and it's probably painting a different story than what's actually going on. Now, am I saying that Putin is good and Zelensky's bad? No, I haven't researched it enough to know that, but I have my doubts and I have my questions when it comes to what's truly going on over there. You've done some study specifically on this in just recent history. We've both done some study as far as what God talks about that region in coming back to end times. But let's start with recent history and all this news about the Russia invasion of there. What's the historical background of conflict in that region?
So Ukraine used to be part of what's called the former Soviet Union, and the town of Kiev, or Kiev as we used to call it, was part of Russia or the whole Soviet Union. But what happened is Ukraine is about 44 million people, and it's a fairly large country. It's bigger than many of the other countries that we don't ever look at maps of the former Soviet Union and contemplate how big it is. It's large. Oh, except for you, Todd.
Yeah, usually weeknights I'm like, what should I do? Let's pull out a map of the old USSR and see what they had going for them.
They did. They had a lot going for them. And it's people decided they didn't want to be part of what was going on with Russia. Russia has always been this kind of strange enigma. Like Churchill called it a mystery wrapped in a riddle, surrounded by an enigma. It's like this hard to read place because it doesn't know whether it's European or Asian. It's kind of this fusion. And it also has this idea that somehow, as many people do, we're destined to rule the world. We need to be the ones in charge. And almost every country has had problems with that problem. The
so does that,
imperialism.
Obviously we know after the Cold War or during the Cold War, after World War II, that's really when the USSR started just gobbling up most of Eastern Europe. And there was a scramble with the US and them after. It's like the enemy of our enemy is our friend during the war, but as soon as it was over, then we're like, okay, we both had our fingers on our guns looking at each other. But does it go back to Stalin and Lenin as well? Are we talking a long history of them trying to rule the world, or has that just been a 20th century and beyond thing?
Yeah, part of what happens is you have to try to get inside the mind of Vladimir Putin, and you start to realize that you want to look at his education, who were his influences, what were the people that surrounded him. And so you look at the history of what's going on in that region, and you start to figure out this is a region that has always had conflict, which is similar to many other places in the world. But it's always had, they've been attacked from beneath them by the Mongols and China. And that place. They've been attacked from Europe by Germany in World War II and by Napoleon. Napoleon tried to invade Russia from the French. I mean, imagine that, a French army.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're going to lose them again.
Throwing crepes and